Thank you for your interest in Getting the Vote, Women's Rights History. I'm Leigh Kitcher, member of the Board of Directors for Historic Vienna Incorporated in Vienna, Virginia. I created a 5-year series of exhibits for Historic Vienna to honor the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The exhibit modules cover the women's rights movement from the very beginnings before the Civil War or right through to the present day. This presentation covers the time period up until the passage of the 19th Amendment. One could say that the women's rights movement began with a letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams in March of 1776. Her husband, John, was a member of the committee tasked with the responsibility of drafting the Constitution for the newly formed United States of America. She begged him not to put unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. She begged him to remember the ladies and allow them a voice in the new government. In the end, the new Constitution allowed each state to decide who had the right to vote. And in 1776, New Jersey was the only state that allowed women to vote. Their Constitution allowed all free inhabitants to vote, and specifically later reinforced that decision that women were allowed to vote. In the 18th century, women were not educated. In fact, it was generally thought that women should not be educated. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a paper titled Vindication of the Rights of Women. In her paper, she argued that women were essential to the nation because they educated their children and should be educated too. Women could be better companions to their husbands if they understood the thoughts and issues that the husbands were contending with. And further, she argued that women were human beings deserving the same fundamental rights as men and should be educated. Mary's words were the first to put down on paper these sort of issues and thoughts. It's hard to believe these popular reasons from the 18th centuries why people thought women shouldn't be educated. I just can't imagine having a nervous breakdown if I had to compete in a man's world, or to lose my purity from something that I read, or that I wouldn't be able to reproduce properly if I was educated, or that I would be an unfit mother. This is very strange to us today, but every one of these were common beliefs at the time. A woman's marital status determined her legal standing. State law, rather than federal law, governed women's rights. Under the law, women were decidedly dependent, subservient, and unequal. Unmarried women, including widows, were able to live where they pleased, support themselves in any occupation that did not require a license or college degree, which was restricted to males. Single women could enter into contracts, buy and sell real estate, or accumulate personal property, which consisted of everything that could be moved: cash, stocks, bonds, livestock, and in the South, slaves. So long as they remained unmarried, women could sue and be sued, write wills, serve as guardians, and act as executors of estates. These rights were a continuation of the colonial legal tradition, but the revolutionary emphasis on equality brought some important changes in women's inheritance rights. State lawmakers everywhere abolished primogeniture and the tradition of double shares of a parent's estate, inheritance customs that favored the eldest son. Instead, equal inheritance for all children became the rule, a big gain for daughters. Marriage changed women's legal status dramatically. When women married, they still had legal rights, but no longer had autonomy. Instead, they found themselves in positions of almost total dependency on their husbands, which the law called coverture. Coverture was based on the assumption that a family functioned best if the male head of household controlled all of its assets. All property brought by a woman into her marriage or earned during the marriage, including wages, became her husband's. He could manage it or give it away as he chose, without consulting her. A married woman had the right to be maintained in a manner commensurate with her husband's social status. If he refused to provide for her appropriately, she could sue and win support from the courts. One of the most important rights of a married woman was dower, which was designed to provide her with support during widowhood. It consisted of a life estate in 1/3 of the husband's real property if there were children, and 1/2 of it if there were not. A life estate, however, did not mean actual ownership. It was meant only to provide for the wife as her husband would have done had he lived. When the widow died, her dower lands descended automatically to her husband's heirs or his creditors. A solvent husband could leave his widow more than the dower if he chose to. Women who owned property did not have the right to vote, but they still had the right to pay taxes. All of the new states recognized the need to end unhappy marriages. The choice of appropriate remedies varied considerably. Some states, particularly in the South, only allowed separate residence with alimony, called divorce from bed and board. Other states granted absolute divorce with the right of the innocent party to remarry. Child custody rights changed after the Revolution. The courts were increasingly willing to bypass colonial precedents that favored men in custody disputes. Instead, they placed young children and daughters, although not sons, under the care of the mothers. In 1807, 31 years after New Jersey granted women the right to vote, New Jersey removed the right to vote from all women. In 1809, Connecticut formalized a law allowing women to write wills. In 1821, Connecticut enacted the country's first abortion law. Abortion before quickening, the first signs of fetal movement, usually during the second trimester, was generally considered acceptable as early as colonial times. Connecticut enacted this new law in response to questionable potions being sold by traveling salesmen, becoming very popular with young women with problems. Previously, a young woman with a problem would go to her midwife, who would help her with her problem at the right time, but never after the second trimester. These women were dying. In 1815, women were beginning to be educated through the female seminary movement. Many different schools were being created. By early 1800, it was generally accepted that girls and boys could both be educated. However, girls' education stopped after the end of secondary school. Only boys were allowed to carry on to college. Girls were allowed to go to a women's school for teaching them the finer social skills that they will need to be good housewives. In 1836, Sarah Joseph Hale became the editor of Godey's Lady's Book. Under her management, circulation reached 150,000. She promoted women's education. The articles in her book were on fashion, health, architecture, beauty, gardening, cooking, religion, and other skills necessary to run an efficient and wonderful household. In 1833, Oberlin College, founded by abolitionists, admitted both African and American women from the beginning. In 1836, Georgia Female College, now Wesleyan College, opened. It was the first school to use the term college. In 1837, Mount Holyoke Female Seminary opened for women only and encouraged middle-class women to have a higher education. In 1861, Vassar College became the first women's college to maintain academic standards equal to those of men's colleges. Coeducation was a big issue. At the Declaration of Rights for Women at the Seneca Falls conference held by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, they decided that they really thought that coeducation was essential. However, it wasn't terribly popular. But by 1860, it became the norm, not because people wanted it, but because it was so much cheaper than educating girls and boys separately. After the Revolution, parishioners stopped going to church as it was no longer required to attend church. Prior to the Revolution, the Church of England required every resident in good standing to attend church regularly. However, with the division of church and state in the new country, that was no longer necessary. In order to lure parishioners back into church, churches began programs of reform. First, they asked the families to come and help the poor. And then they asked the families to support other initiatives, the first of which was anti-slavery. In 1831, Charles Grandison Finney was the first reverend to allow women to pray aloud in gatherings of men and women. Prior to that, women were not allowed to speak at all in public, let alone in church. In 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed, but they would not allow women to sign the declarations. So the Female Anti-Slavery Society was formed. In 1836, Ernestine Rose began lecturing to groups of women on the subject of the science of government, including the enfranchisement of women. Angelina Grimke wrote a pamphlet encouraging women to work for abolition. When she and her sister Sarah were criticized for speaking in public, they began to work for women's rights. These women were the first to speak in public about women's right to vote. In 1841, the first women received their college degrees from Oberlin College. And in 1839, Mississippi passes the first statute, although it was limited, allowing married women to have some property rights. In 1840, the World Anti-Slavery Convention was held in London, but they refused to seat the 6 women who were delegates from the American Anti-Slavery Society. So the entire delegation sat in the upper decks watching the whole convention. This is where Lucretia Mott met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they became fast friends, discussing the issues with respect to slavery and justice in the world. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's father was a judge, so she was well versed in all the laws that prevented women from having the same rights as men. In 1845, Margaret Fuller published the Great Lawsuit, asking women to claim themselves as self-dependent rather than depending on their husbands for everything. In 1848, Gerrit Smith made women's suffrage a plank in the Liberty Party platform for the first time. New York, after much effort, passes Married Women's Property Right Act, which allowed married women to have property rights. Anesthesia was first used in childbirth, making that much easier for women. And Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton held the first Seneca Falls Conference, resulting in the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments for Women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a young mother with 2 sons who had just moved to Seneca Falls, New York, having left the Boston area for her husband's health. She really missed the intellectual stimulation and activity that she had with respect to the abolitionist and other reform movements in the Boston area. She wrote to her friends, and she concluded that she could hold a conference at Seneca Falls on the rights of women. She and Lucretia Mott set up the conference, and it was attended by 300 people. They drafted the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments using the Declaration of Independence as a model. All resolutions passed easily, with the exception of the right to vote. That is, until Frederick Douglass spoke in favor of it, and then it passed easily. Of the 300 attendees, 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. The event was covered very well in the press of the day. Lucy Stone attended Oberlin College and graduated with a degree. But to fund her college education, she taught school before she went to college and all through her college education. However, she was not paid the same rate as the men. She was a very avid debater, top of her class in debates. She could out-debate most men. So it was no surprise that in 1848, after graduating, she became a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. She earned her living lecturing on abolition. She went to the territories and she went to the states, and she spoke on abolition, usually charging a penny a talk. That funded her travel as well as her living. But then she realized that she could talk about women's rights. So she started educating people on women's rights 3 days of the week. In 1851, she focused entirely on women's rights. Over the years, Stone lectured on women's rights throughout the country, and the states are listed here. In 1849, Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott held Pennsylvania's first women's rights meeting. After the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, it became clear that there was strong support for women's suffrage from both men and women. In 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was held, and annual conventions were held nearly every year until 1860. These conventions were attended by as many as 1,000 people from 11 different states and even brand new states. Speakers included prominent men and women. Frederick Douglass was a regular speaker. Women from all kinds of backgrounds were asked to help move the organization forward. And Susan B. Anthony spoke at every convention from 1852 until the end. Many now famous speeches were given at these conventions. Ernestine Rose was remembered for saying, "At marriage, a woman loses her entire identity, and her being is said to have become merged into her husband. Has her nature merged too?" These speeches will never be forgotten. A common theme was enacting laws that helped women in some way, if not to give them the right to vote, but to give them guardianship rights, to allow divorce for wives of alcoholics, tax exemptions for women until they got the right to vote, a right to trial before a jury of their peers, and many other things. The coming of the American Civil War ended the annual National Women's Rights Conventions and focused women's activism on the issue of emancipation for slaves. The New York State Legislature repealed in 1862 much of the gain that women had made in 1860. This 1856 cartoons illustrates the vast array of reform opportunities that men and women had during the 1850s, from slavery to abolition to alcohol prohibition, pacifism, socialism, feminism, and including free love. This cartoon is wonderful in depicting all of those isms. This cartoon from one of the last National Women's Rights Conventions shows something that was very unusual prior to that time. Women in public speaking with men in the same room. Men are jeering up in the balconies, both sides. Women are happy and unhappy, and looking elegant and looking frumpy. Comedy is entertaining. In 1851, Amelia Bloomer decided that it was much more comfortable to adopt the Turkish fashion of trousers rather than the long, flowy skirts. And Lucy Stone, who was riding on buckboards all through the Wild West in our territories, traipsing through muddy tracks, she thought, well, bloomers are really practical when you're traveling under those conditions. So she started lecturing in bloomers. But bloomers were ridiculed, very much so. And the other cartoon is talking about a young woman, a father, wanting to allow this young woman to marry his son. And he's saying, well, gosh, can you keep him in the style to which he's been accustomed? So they're making fun of the women and their right to earn income. Lucy Stone, by the way, had married, well, she ended up marrying her husband, but she would not take his name, and she kept him in the style to which he was accustomed, with no rights to her money. She had a contract that he signed prior to their marriage. Finally, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was adopted, and it abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. So the abolitionist movement had been successful in achieving their objective. Painfully, but it was achieved. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified. This amendment granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. It appeared that all of the efforts of the abolitionists had been achieved. In 1866, the American Equal Rights Association was formed. The goal was to achieve equal voting rights for people of either gender or any race. And most of the suffragist leaders were very supportive of this association and participated in it. However, in 1869, it became clear that Congress could only agree to support suffrage for either women or African Americans. So, in 1869, Lucy Stone formed the American Women's Suffrage Association in order to get the 15th Amendment passed for former slaves and any man. And after that was passed, the idea would be that she could get the vote for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did not agree with this. And in 1870, Lucy Stone founded the Women's Journal, a publication voicing the concerns of the AWSA. This journal had vast distribution and a vast group of supporters. In 1866, rather than supporting the Equal Rights Association and supporting the 14th or the 15th Amendments, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton lobbied strongly against ratification of either of those amendments. They preferred to have white women get the vote rather than African American men. In 1869, Anthony and Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association and championed a number of radical women's issues, including issues such as the right to say no to your husband, the right to increased opportunities, the right to serve on juries, the right to keep your children, the right to have gender-neutral divorce laws, and many other rights that we would consider to be reasonable rights today. But they were considered very radical and questionable, so their movement was smaller in size than the movement created by Lucy Stone and the other suffrage leaders that she worked with. However, in 1881 and to 1885, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Gage wrote the history of women's suffrage, and they wrote out all of the role of the others, including African American women who fought very hard for the right for women to vote. And they championed their own opinions and their own history above the others. Many Jews and African Americans fought for the women's right to vote. A Jewish woman, Ernestine Rose, who made her fortune in perfume and other things, came to the United States and, being enamored of the freedoms that we espoused, began lecturing on abolition, slavery, religious tolerance, public education, and equality for women. Of the significant African Americans, we have Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, among many others, who have spoken and worked very hard for awareness of the rights of women and supporting women and legal standing for them. At the same time that women were fighting for the right to vote, women were being seen as a bit too aggressive. This cartoon from 1869 shows a woman smoking, a woman running for sheriff, and managing the ballot box, women looking rather frivolous in their outfits or angry, and making men take care of the babies rather than women. So there were many views that women should not be voting or out of the home. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified. It prohibits the federal government and each state from denying a citizen the right to vote based on that citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The states still had the right to deny or award the right to vote based on gender. In 1872, Victoria Woodhull ran as the equal rights candidate for president. Unfortunately, she was under 35 at the time, and many do not consider her candidacy a valid candidacy. Her running mate was the black abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass. She was quite impressive. She made her first fortune as a magnetic healer and her second fortune by opening a stock brokerage firm. She was a smart cookie, but as an advocate of free love, she alienated many people. Women tried many tactics to try and gain the right to vote, or to challenge the rules that were there. In 1873, Susan B. Anthony and 6 other women in Rochester, New York, tried to vote. They were arrested and they were tried, but they tried to vote, challenging the status quo. By 1890, women still hadn't won the right to vote. They hadn't made too much progress. Lucy Stone was nearing her death, and she thought, well, we need to all work together. So she joined forces with the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and her group, the American Suffrage Association, and joined them. And she allowed them, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, to lead the new organization entitled the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Although the right for women to vote was very much in the eyes of the public, both in the United States and all around the world, it was made fun of quite a bit. One of my favorites is this cartoon where a woman with very odd attire is going to a bookseller asking for a her book rather than a him book, which I found amusing. And the other one on the right is an English cartoon that criticizes a woman's ability to get into the voting booth because of her outrageous attire. In 1905, Susan B. Anthony was 85 years old, but she was still full of vigor, as seen here chasing Grover Cleveland out of office, with Uncle Sam laughing with humor. They dare to show her ankles, although they do cover them with spats. This was covered widely and a source of humor on everyone's part. These two early cartoons, 1905 and 1907, show what people thought was on a woman's mind. On the left, we have clothes, hats, letters, marriage, suitors, chocolates, babies, pets. And on the right, it's votes for women, taxation without representation, wanting the rights, we are as good as men and better. All we ask is the ballot box and won't be happy till we get it. Two views, both very popular in the community. And cartoons. Women bring all the voters in the world. Why can't women vote? Or, gosh, you could have Carrie Chapman Catt as Uncle Sam. Doesn't she look dashing or vicious or manly? This English cartoon shows the lengths to which women will go to achieve the right to vote. Here they are seen as prisoners, having been arrested after demonstrations, and also dignifying the prison itself, offering afternoon tea with music and other amenities. Public opinion was varied. On the left, you see the origin of a suffragette. She's a little girl, then a coquette, and then not married, an old lady, and then a suffragette. And on the right, they're arguing that cleaning the house, being a nurse, working in a factory, working in a shop, serving in a tea room, or being a lady voting is just fine. We're all proper women and we can do it all. In 1910, Washington became the 5th state to award women the right to vote. And this wonderful cartoon is showing that Uncle Sam now has 5 daughters. And on the other side, there are a number of women being taught in a schoolroom how to vote. This very visual cartoon is showing how the states that have offered women votes are leading the way in glory and liberty to their sisters who have been downtrodden and entrenched on the East. Very dramatic. Even before they were states, these territories granted women the right to vote. Very impressive. However, the population still is resisting votes for women, a feeling that life at home would never be the same if women had the right to vote. The poor old man, represented by the rooster, will have to be home taking care of the chicks, not knowing what to do. There was great success in the territories that became new states to grant women the right to vote. These states all granted women the right to vote prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment. Surprisingly, women in the East lobbied heavily against referendums that would grant women the right to vote. And it was only in 1917 that New York granted women the right to vote. But no other East Coast states granted women the right to vote prior to the 19th Amendment. In 1916, the first woman was elected to Congress. Jeanette Rankin was elected to represent the state of Montana. There were many criticisms of her election, some talking about her hats, talking about ideas that she's bringing into Congress like suffrage and war demands and social reform. But a charming thing from the Charlotte Observer from Charlotte, North Carolina, refers to her as the Republican candidate who is elected from a Montana district, is of course of small stature and pretty as a peach. All North Carolina female products of that general descriptive character. Charming. We're all pretty as a peach. Prior to the U.S. joining the war, the U.S. provided materials and other supplies to the Allies to fight the war. The government put pressure on companies to ramp up production, so companies hired more women and hired women into positions that were previously held only by men. Women excelled in these positions and did a superior job. In addition, when the U.S. joined the war, many branches of the military started allowing women to join. The yeomanettes, the Navy, were the first to enlist women, and the women were paid as men, but they had to buy their own uniforms. And the first battle that included women was fought in January 1918. By the end of the war, all of the branches of the military had women included in their service. The viewpoint of military service was that it was volunteer. Many people believed that a woman had to be able to defend her country in order to gain the right to vote. After all, that's how the Revolutionary veterans won their right to vote. In the war, women worked tirelessly in the battlefields as nurses, doctors, and even telephone operators, as they were very much better than men in this capacity. They also worked on the home front as farmers, mechanics, munition workers, mine workers, yeomen, and much, much more. Why aren't they getting enfranchisement? That's all they want, the right to vote, the right to have a say in how we govern our country. In 1916, women still hadn't won the right to vote. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, decided on a winning plan. She decided that those women in states that had already won suffrage would work for a national amendment, that states that had a good chance of winning state suffrage were to really work hard for state suffrage. And in states where it didn't seem likely at all that women would win the right to vote, women were to fight for the right to vote at least in a primary or a local election, or maybe even a presidential election. All of these initiatives were more of lobbying and demonstrating in the form of a parade or lectures. Carrie Chapman Catt's plan was effective in winning the right to vote in New York, Michigan, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. Her plan also allowed women to vote for president only in Nebraska, Ohio, Indiana, North Dakota, Rhode Island, Iowa, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. The plan clearly had a significant impact on people's opinions. After trying Carrie Chapman Catt's program of lobbying for the right to vote, a group of women decided that wasn't effective enough. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, coming from picketing in the UK, thought that it would be a good idea to picket the White House. Harriet Stanton Blatch, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, decided that it was time to have a new departure, and she agreed that picketing would be a good idea. So women of stature, you can see in this photo that the women are all well dressed, are very quietly standing as silent sentinels with their banners picketing the White House so that President Wilson would pay attention to the need for women to have suffrage. On January 10, 1917, the National Women's Party first began their picketing. They were the first group of any kind to picket in front of the White House. On March 4th, President Wilson ignored the 1,000 women marching around the White House during his inauguration. While this picketing is happening, the very first woman on March 17th enlisted in the U.S. Navy. And on April 2nd, Jeannette Rankin joined with her colleagues to vote against the war that President Wilson proposed that we join. The picketing continued through August of 1917 without too much incident. The women picketed, people jeered, and they tolerated the picketers. But on August 14th, the picketers were attacked by men, many of them soldiers and sailors. And after 3 days of riots, 6 pickets are arrested, tried, and sentenced to 30 days in the Occoquan workhouse. Through the month of September, the picketers continued picketing. They were arrested, they were sentenced to 60 days in Occoquan, and went out and picketed again. The women demanded to be treated as political prisoners. And in October, 12 pickets, including Alice Paul, were arrested and given 7 months rather than 60 days. Alice Paul and Rose Winslow go on hunger strikes and were force-fed. During this time, Carrie Chapman Catt continued her efforts with lobbying, and in November, that succeeded in the New York State passing the women's suffrage in a referendum, as you can see in the picture where women are carrying a ballot box that they can now use. November 10th, 41 women were arrested and sent to Occoquan prison. On the 14th, the infamous Night of Terror occurred. The women continued to be demanded to be treated as political prisoners and go on hunger strike. The superintendent thought he would control them by beating them brutally in an attempt to teach them a lesson. They were beaten and manhandled into cells. Lucy Burns was left all night with her wrists handcuffed to her cell door above her head. They were refused treatment for their injuries, even while they feared one of the suffragists had had a heart attack. This group also joined the hunger strike. Because the D.C. jails were full up, the women from August through November were held in prison at Occoquan in Virginia, rather than in a District of Columbia jail. So on November 23rd, the National Women's Party was successful in using a writ of habeas corpus to make the government produce the prisoners in court in the District of Columbia and explain why they were being held at Occoquan when they had been sentenced to serve their time in the District of Columbia. The judge ordered the prisoners to be returned to the district jail, but since there was no room in the district jail, on November 27th and 28th, all of the imprisoned suffragists were released, and in some cases, not in very good physical condition. This incident changed public opinion about the women's suffrage movement. The public now thought that women should not be treated so badly, and President Wilson himself worked towards the passage of the 19th Amendment. And by August 18th of 1920, the 19th Amendment passed. This amendment says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. so women now had the right to vote. Alice Paul raises a glass, toasting women winning the right to vote. But she didn't stop there. She continued her work by proposing the Equal Rights Amendment. And the amendment hasn't changed in its wording. And unfortunately, the amendment still has not passed. This cartoon shows that we still have a lot of work ahead of us. We have, with the equal suffrage halfway up the ladder, achieved the right to vote. But at the top of the ladder is the office of the presidency. And we still have yet to achieve that. But it may be closer to our grasp than it has ever been before. Thank you for listening, and keep fighting for everyone's equal rights.